Welcome to Sketchbook study page of one of the most beautiful autumn leaves, maple leaves. Autumn leaves are rich in different shades of brown watercolor mixes. I will be using Indian yellow, alizarin crimson, sap green for most of my brown watercolor mixes. Also Indian yellow, alizarin crimson, and ultramarine blue as another variety for brown watercolor mixes. Adding perlin maroon, perlin violet. You can really experiment here to make different kind of brown watercolor color shades. Adding a little bit more red to make brown watercolor mix more closer to red side. Adding more green pigment, and that brown will be more greener. And I'm starting by applying a water layer with round synthetic brush. This leaf will be a little bit looser than my usual watercolor paintings. To get a quicker study of maple leaf in a sketchbook page, but this is also a nice starting point for any realistic painting. It's just a matter of how much effort you want to put in your painting or study page. If you want to catch a quick look at the composition or how your watercolor mixes are working, you can go for a looser painting to have a much quicker result. Reference photo is my guidance, and I'm adding alizarin crimson because I see that on some part of this leaf there are some more vivid red colors. And while the surface is still moist, I'm blending with my round synthetic brush very lightly into each other. I don't want to overblend, overmix on my palette. Also adding sap green to the tip of the sleeve, so I'm not overworking to avoid muddying the colors. If I lightly push them into each other with few brush strokes, then they will stay as they are. Reds are red, browns are brown. If I will overdo that, overmix, too much brush strokes, then everything will turn brown. Also adding a little bit darker amount of watercolor mixes to the darker side, where I can see in the reference. We have a reference photo on the screen, but you can also open it right beside the tutorial or on the other gadgets, so you can zoom in closer the exact leaf that we are working right now to see details, tonal values, different color tones. With finer tip brush, I'm adding more lighter transparent layer on the curved part of the sleeve. And I have my color palette with different brown watercolor mixes because I was practicing some brown watercolor mixing, and I'm not washing my palette if I know that I will be using those watercolors. For example, I knew that I will be painting maple leaves, which are super rich with brown watercolor mixes, and I left my color palette, we can say dirty, but it's not dirty. There are so many watercolors that can be used while painting some other work. With finer tip brush, carefully adding watercolors to all curved areas of the sleeve. There are some little pieces like this one that are darker. Everything is visible in the reference. I'm following the guidances that are there. All information that I need is there. And with finer tip brush, with the very tip of the brush, I'm applying very fine, thin line to the stem part. Fallen autumn leaves are already dead, and stems and veins are becoming thinner and more crisper just because there's no more life in those veins in that stem. No nutrients are being transferred to the leaf, so they are drying out, becoming darker, crisper, thinner. And to have beautiful autumn leaves, we need that crispness and those very thin stems and veins. If you will have a thick stem, it will not look so natural. with finer tip brush, painting veins. Beauty of autumn leaves that we don't need to worry about veins to leave them light, as for example green leaves have, but most of the autumn leaves are with brown veins. They are dried out veins. Before painting fine veins, you can practice on separate piece of paper so your brush strokes are really thin and crisp. Don't go straight to watercolor painting if you don't feel sure about your brush strokes. Practicing brush strokes, it's like a little warm-up before each painting session. Especially in the beginning of your artistic journey, these little things like practicing brush strokes, practicing watercolor mixing, different color wheels are very important if you want to succeed, if you want to feel more freer within your painting process. Now I'm outlining veins, darker line on the right side, which is in the shadow, and much thinner line on the left side. I can see in the reference that the veins are outlined from both sides, adding perlin violet, Indian yellow, a little bit of alizarin crimson, and indigo to make a really dark and saturated watercolor mix. As this is a really quite quick watercolor study of maple leaves in the sketchbook, I will be applying smaller amount of layers, going a little bit more saturated than usual. The result will not be so super realistic as really worked through paintings, but I'm still sticking to realistic result, but just a little bit more easier, looser, smoothing the applied layer. And with the finer tip brush, careful, we don't want to step over the lines, the edge lines of the maple leaf. And here you can really experiment with brown watercolor mixes. The more colors, different varieties of mixes you will add, the richer your leaves are going to look at the end. Here we can see in reference there are so many colors in just this one leaf. If we would pick up maple leaf in summer, it is green. There are different varieties of green, but not so rich in color tones like it is now. Adding alizarin crimson to the areas that I see in reference are vividly more red rather than brown, but even those reds have a little touch of brown in it, just a little bit to the red side. Some browns are more to the yellow side or more to the green side, but the base still for all the colors are brown, giving more extra contrast to the curved area of the leaf with some shadows, especially lower side of the curve is in the shadow to show that it is curved, that it is roundish, more tonal values. Adding Perlin Violet to my mixing palette. Indigo, be really careful with these two pigments. They're super strong and saturated. I always add them one little touch at one mixing time because this is a really dark pigments, Perlin Violet and Indigo, and you can quickly block all your layers if you add them too much. Carefully with finer tip brush, watching for the edges. And now we can start painting other leaf, which is slightly different. Curved area is darker here and the inner part is lighter. There are more yellows, more greens, and I'm starting with Indian yellow and sap green, the curved area. I see that the curved area has a lot of green, which means it's not fallen down so far ago. It still has some life of green color in it. The ones that are super brown, it means that those leaves are completely dead or life has left that area. But this leaf particular, it has some life in it with the green color. Using round synthetic brush, adding while the surface is still moist with the little stippling touch of a brush, I'm adding watercolors. Carefully smoothing. I want first layers to be smooth and transparent, and later I will build layers. Technique is the same as we did with the first one. I'm painting looser than usual, looking at reference constantly, checking, comparing tonal values. Even color tones can change because there's so great variety of color tones. You don't need to be 100% accurate that yellow is in that particular spot or some green is there. You can play here with color tones, but be consistent with tonal values. To make this leaf look realistic, it's all about tonal values. We can paint it or tone it black and white and make it realistic. So here with color tones you can play, but be really careful with tonal values in order to make it look realistic. Adding small amount of water to inner part of the leaf, starting with Indian yellow, where is a little bit of alizarin crimson because it's more to the orangey side. And carefully with round synthetic brush, applying watercolors, moving them where I need. The water is just enough for watercolors to be moved. I don't have water puddles and watercolors are floating by themselves. This is a completely different technique, more suitable for landscapes and seascapes. In subject painting, botanical watercolor painting, we need greater control of watercolors that we are applying. Sap green for little corners that look more greener than yellow. And constantly checking with reference. adding more sap green, and in that sap green there's a little bit of brown mixes that I already have on my palette, also Indian yellow and alizarin crimson, which makes sap green even more earthy looking watercolor pigment. Applying watercolors on the right side of the veins and smoothing, because veins are creating these little curves and there's light on one side of the curve and then there's shadow on the other side. Mixing a little touch of indigo and perlin violet on my color palette to have a really dark mix, and with a fine line making greater contrast on the stems. And I'm adding that fine line on the right side of the stem. Even that stem is super thin, but my tip of the brush is even thinner, and I can have that fine line on the right side. It will help look this stem more realistic, more three-dimensional, because I have lights and shadow even on that super thin area. As I have all 3 leaves on my sketchbook one page, I can look at them both, comparing reference photo and my sketchbook page, maybe add contrast here and there just to adjust the composition. You can make it even looser. This is your sketchbook. Maybe you don't want your study to be so realistic or so saturated. You can definitely go much looser, more lighter. This is your choice. This is a practice for mixing watercolors for autumn, playing with color tones, playing with tonal values to make these leaves look realistic, but the intensity of the result is up to you. I'm adding also a transparent layer of Indian yellow for my right leaf, adding more layers there. I feel that I want it to look a little bit darker because all these 3 leaves compared, the middle one is the lightest, then the right one is a little bit darker, and the left one is the darkest one. Left one was painted with my Patreon online school students, and we did a live session for this leaf, and it was really detailed. Just this one leaf took 1 hour of painting session. This is what you can get if you are more concentrating on realistic result or on the result that looks more natural and more realistic. These 2 that we just painted are a bit looser, are a bit simpler, but in half an hour they both are finished. So this is a great way to practice leaf, to make some composition notes in your sketchbook, write down watercolor mixes right beside them. So this is like a study before maybe a larger painting. Last leaf in this class is a little bit different than the 3 above. It is more red and yellow. So I have on my color palette a lot of alizarin crimson together with perlin maroon and a little bit of perlin violet. Also Indian yellow. And I'm applying first layer completely Indian yellow because I can see from the reference, and I have that leaf right beside me to check, to see, to turn around. And I see there's a lot of yellow. So the base for this leaf of yellow pigment will be wonderful to start with. We can also wipe out the areas that are the lightest ones or just apply a super transparent layer there. It will be also enough because this leaf is also dark, and to get this saturation we will build layers. And now alizarin crimson together with perlin maroon for the shadow parts where I can see there's a lot of red in there, but still yellow base is perfect for this leaf. I waited a few minutes for the layer to be completely dry, for the paper to be ready to receive another layer of watercolors and water. Always follow that. If you are painting one layer after another, at one point you need to stop and let the paper rest. It's super important for any paper to perform at its best. Time to time, leave paper to dry completely, and then it will be ready to receive another layer of watercolors and water. Painting further with transparent layers, looking at reference, seeing where are shadows. Lemon yellow transparent layer gives a nice warmth, and also this luminous look. Yellow pigment gives a nice touch to autumn leaves, and in this leaf it is more obvious than in the previous ones, but in the previous ones we also used a lot of yellow color. I'm painting veins with my round synthetic brush, but you can definitely use here finer tip brush. It's a matter of your control, how you're controlling your brush. Even with the wider brush, you can make super fine brush strokes, and with the finest tip brush, you can make thick brush strokes. So it's also a matter how you are controlling, how you are holding your brush. Here I'm taking finer tip brush to make those veins even crisper, using Perlin Violet and Indigo watercolor mix. Adding more darkness and contrast to the shadow parts, where we have on the left side little curve, and that curve is casting a lot of shadow on that part of the leaf where the light can't reach the surface of that leaf. And still detailing, layering. This is also the point where you can decide this is enough. I'm completely satisfied with this leaf study. Again, we are talking about leaf study, not a, for example, a painting that you want to exhibit somewhere. This is a leaf study. Or you can push yourself and paint more, add more layers. This definitely can go darker, because compared to the reference is much darker and more detailed. There are veins, secondary veins, which you can add, of course, some little spots and dots, and then this study can slowly turn into a finished painting. But for now, my aim here is just a sketchbook study page, but I'm keeping it realistic and a little bit simpler. To be enjoyed about the process, to be in the process, sometimes we need to paint something simpler, and that is not asking a lot of attention from us. It gives a different perspective. It's also an experiment. Maybe you decide that looser style is for you, or simpler illustrations for you, or you are just a little bit pausing for super detailed, just to play around with colors, to fill Sketchbook. Sketchbook is a wonderful place where you can experiment, where you can test new pigments, new techniques, new compositions that maybe later will turn into a beautiful artwork. Adding final details, last layers to this leaf painting. And I'm leaving the rest of the leaves for you to try and experiment on your own. Here is the finished page, sketchbook page of my maple leaves, and this looks wonderful. Learned a lot, hope you too. Thank you and see you in next tutorial.